Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nell Pepper, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am delighted to introduce this virtual event with renowned folklorist Maria Tatar in conversation with Moira Weigel, and we'll be presenting Maria Tatar's new book, The Heroine with 1001 Faces. Thank you so much for joining us virtually tonight. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community, as well as our current and new digital community. Every week we host events here on our Zoom account. Our fall events calendar is chock full of fascinating speakers, including Richard Powers, Farah Jasmine Griffin, Jelani Cobb, and Karl Ove Knausgaard. Please check out the event schedule on our website at harvard.com/events. And while you're there, you can sign up for our email newsletter for more updates. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button on your screen and we will get through as many as time allows. In the chat, I will be posting a link to purchase copies of The Heroine with 1001 Faces on harvard.com, as well as a link to donate in support of the series and of our store. Your purchases and financial contributions make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore in Harvard Square. We thank you so much for showing up and tuning in, both in support of our authors and of the fantastic staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. I'd also like to let you know we have transcriptions and captioning available for this event. You might need to enable them yourself. You'll find them under the button that says live transcript. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. Of course, we hope they don't, but if they do, we will do our best to resolve them quickly. Thank you so much for your patience and understanding. And now I am so pleased to introduce our speakers. Maria Tatar is the author of Enchanted Hunters, is the editor and translator of annotated editions of works by Hans Christian Andersen and the Brothers Grimm, and the editor of an annotated edition of J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan. She is the John L. Loeb Research Professor of Folklore and Mythology and Germanic Languages and Literatures at Harvard University, as well as a senior fellow of the Harvard Society of Fellows. Moira Weigel is the author of Labor of Love, The Invention of Dating. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, The Guardian, The Nation, The New Republic, and N+1, among other publications, and she is a co-founder of Logic magazine. In 2016, she received a fellowship to the Harvard Society of Fellows. Tonight, they will be discussing Maria Tatar's latest book, The Heroine with 1001 Faces, as is clear from the title, with its references both to Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces and Scheherazad's 1001 Nights of Surviving Murderous Patriarchy Through the Power of Storytelling. The Heroine with 1001 Faces examines the societal models presented by the legendary women of folklore and epic. Deploying the domestic crafts and using words as weapons, these women found ways to survive assaults and rescue others from harm, all while repairing the fraying edges in the fabric of their social worlds. I am so pleased to turn things over to our speakers. The digital podium is yours, Maria and Moira.
Thank you, Nell, and thank you so much. Thank you so much for having us to Harvard Bookstore, a sacred place. As someone who studied here, lived here a long time, it's always so nice to come back. And thank you to Maria for inviting me to be in conversation on this book. I was saying right before we got started that it's a really special and moving book to read, having been a student, having studied German literature and stories here with you. I was joking also that reading it reminded me of watching strangely, it's very different gender dynamics, but watching Martin Scorsese's The Irishman. Reading it is like watching watching the master and sort of inventor of a genre remix and work back through and extend that genre. So it's such a pleasure to be able to ask you about it here at the virtual bookstore.
Well, Moira, I'm thrilled to be here, and I want to thank you for this labor of love, if I may use the pun and plug your book a second time. I wish we could be in person, especially since we are practically neighbors, but it's great to talk with you in any medium. And thanks to everyone for showing up, and Harvard Bookstore. We are also grateful to you for keeping your doors open and also for supporting our addiction to books. So you have been heroic, and I loved your words about the fantastic staff of booksellers. Thank you for that.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be here virtually, second only to being there in person, but we at least could walk over and sneak by ourselves soon. I wanted to start out with sort of the big picture. I wondered, and I imagine the answer might be, on the one hand, your entire life, but then also some more specific things. But I wanted to ask you about what inspired the book, sort of how this book began, when you started taking down notes for it and knowing it was the project you wanted to do.
Yes, well, there is the cliche about writing a book all your life, but this was actually a pandemic book. It was written in the dark days and nights of the height of the pandemic, but it sort of goes back to a very specific feel-bad experience of my childhood. And I am in one of those soulless, vast auditoriums where standardized tests are given. And I look down at the sheet of paper, which gives you the prompt for the 1-hour essay question. And it's, what is a hero? And I could remember the names of heroes. That is, I thought Achilles, Jason, Perseus, and I even thought of some modern heroes, Holden Caulfield, Gatsby, and all of that. But the minute I ran through the names of the ancient heroes, I thought, oh my God, these are all natural born killers. You know, there's the towering rage of Achilles, and then, you know, these Perseus decapitating Medusa. Somehow it seemed to me that they were so deeply invested in carnage. They were experts in carnage. And so I remember finding that, you know, I was sort of frozen, slightly paralyzed. And then I wrote a terrible canned essay about courage or something like that. And I remember what a deeply humiliating experience it was. Not that I'm not sure how I did on this test, but I knew that I had done badly, that my response was not, well, maybe sincere is the wrong word, but it was not authentic. There was something that I was searching for that I couldn't put my finger on at the time. But then also, I guess this is the second point I wanted to make about the book and its origins. It was written, as I said, during the pandemic, at a time when we really discovered new forms of heroism in our healthcare workers and also in scientists. So these were men and women who were risking their lives, who were on the front lines and also working tirelessly to find ways to heal us. And I noticed that in the media, there was always a sense that these heroes were italicized or in quotation marks. They weren't really like Achilles or Hercules or something like that, but they embodied, both men and women, I think, embodied the care and the curiosity that I started identifying as the chief features of the heroine. So the pandemic, it was a quiet time. It was eerily silent. I think it was Carlos Fuentes who tells us that all writing is a struggle against silence. And I'm sure you all remember how there were suddenly no traffic noises, no ambient sound, even conversations contracted as we sat in our homes isolated and feeling totally helpless. I mean, what could we do? The best thing, the advice that we got from everyone was stay at home, isolate yourself, quarantine. And that was when I turned to books for comfort and consolation. I refused to go down the rabbit hole of streaming, or I tried very hard not to. But we all know that storytelling has a long history as a balm for those who are living through the plague, through pandemics. So these stories, the books that I read were meant to pass time, but also to heal and to get through hard times. So that's my long answer. Of course, there are many other things, but those I think were the two drivers of the book.
I love the story about the standardized test essay. It's lucky for all of your many students at Harvard a million years later, you know, that you, for all of us all the time, that you suffered that trauma, though I'm sorry that you did. Could you tell us a little bit about Joseph Campbell and how, I mean, this book is clearly, the title is riffing on and playing on the hero with 1,000 faces and is positioned. I'd be curious what noun you use as a response, a rebuttal, or a revision, but is clearly evoking that book. Could you tell us a bit about who Joseph Campbell was and his sort of public intellectual stature, and then how your book is responding, reacting, re-engaging with his?
Oh, yeah, so that's a great question, because I don't see myself as being in competition with Campbell, although my title might suggest that I am, because I'm adding one to his 1,000. So I see it more as a sequel, and as telling the story of the half that Joseph Campbell left out. And Campbell himself was deeply aware that times were changing. He wrote at one point near the end of his life that somehow roles had shifted and he couldn't quite see into the future, but gender roles were changing in radical ways. So Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces came out in 1949. Campbell had been living, I love this story, he was living in upstate New York in a rented shack. He decided that he had quit graduate school because he was forced into pigeonholes. That is, he wasn't allowed to do this or that. And he was somebody who really, was thinking globally before it became, fashionable and right to do so. So there he is reading like crazy. And it takes him almost a decade to write The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And of course, what has happened? World War II, he is about to be drafted. And although he celebrates military heroes in his book, he was somebody who was deeply opposed to the military. He studied Native American mythology when he was very young, and he was outraged by the US treatment of indigenous people, how they had been robbed of their land. He also detested the British for their imperialism and for guns and cannon, as he put it. So he's writing at a time, of course, when soldiers are going off to war, when the veterans are returning as war heroes. He himself planned to become a conscientious objector. At the last minute, he felt that it was his patriotic duty to go to enlist, but turned out that he just missed the date. He was 37, I think, when he would have been drafted, and that was just a year above the age. So Campbell writes this book. He then teaches at Sarah Lawrence, an all-women's college at the time. And he tells the story about a young woman coming into his office and asking about women, about where were the women. And Campbell said, he responded by saying, well, women give birth to the hero, and they're also the goal of the hero. What more do you want? And the senior who was taking his popular course turned to him and said, I want to be the hero. And so I think, there was a kind of dawning consciousness, as I said, that, he had not quite figured that out. And of course, The Hero with 1,000 Faces became the playbook for Hollywood, that is, for many decades. And I think partly through PBS's series, The Power of Myth, he became a kind of spiritual guru. And then there's Christopher Folklor's The Writer's Journey, which was required reading for all screenwriters for a time. So I guess a shorter answer is I grew to admire Campbell. I think I started out being deeply skeptical, as many folklorists are today, about archetypes and timeless universals and all of that has been discarded by the Academy. But I grew to respect his adventurousness, his willingness to go all over the world in search of stories. He looked at the great cauldron of stories, not just folk tales or literature. He wrote his thesis on Joyce. So he was interested in literature, religion, myth, folklore, everything. And so yes, I would say that I did a real I made a real turn in my thinking about the value of his work and his contributions.
It's so interesting. And I'd love to come back to maybe this question of the global and sort of thinking the global, and then also similarities and difference globally, because I think from the perspective of conversations happening in the culture about feminism and women's stories, there's also all these conversations happening now about whether we can speak of women as a whole, or whether differences of race and class and geography make that impossible. And so I'm going to ask you about that later, but before, and maybe actually as a way into that, I was curious to ask, or I wanted to ask if you could lay out what is the heroine's journey, or what is, well, maybe actually it'd be useful to say just a little bit about the hero's journey. What is this form or schema that Campbell lays out in brief, so we have that to refer to?
Yeah. Well, I will be very brief, and that's part of its appeal, is that it can be summarized so easily. It's a 12-step journey, and I'm not going to enumerate all of the steps. You can find them online quite easily, but basically it can be boiled down to departure, initiation, return, which is kind of the template for all stories. That is a kind of journey. But one of the things that when I was first drifting toward the idea of writing this book, the contrast that I set up was between the hero's journey. It goes out into the world, conquers, slays dragons, or undergoes a spiritual crisis of some, because Campbell's heroes are either warriors or spiritual leaders. They are the founders of civilization and that kind of thing. They bring back an elixir, a balm, some magic potion that has a healing quality to it. So my first move was to think about the heroine's ordeal, because they are positioned as, they're silent, they're suffering, and they're working through these terrible situations. Many of the narratives I read, they're enslaved, and the rewrites of the Odyssey and the Iliad, which have, kind of multiplied over the past few years. The rewrites of ancient stories have been extraordinary and have given us a different point of view, but not just about suffering and silence. If I learned anything from several years of working on the annotated African-American folktales with Henry Louis Gates Jr., it was that enslaved peoples find resources. That is, they mobilize resistance, they're resilient, they are clever, they are intelligent, they talk to each other, they use talk, and they find ways, maybe not necessarily to escape from their situation. There may be no escape hatch, but they find ways to live. And so that was a real turning point for me. That is, how do they become agents? And, again, these are huge generalizations of Moira, and I admire, and we should talk about specificity, because, part of my project is to look backward, to look at the stories that we've written and recorded and see how they bifurcate along gender lines. And I think today you would have to write a completely different story because those stereotypes, archetypes have been dismantled.
When you were speaking, and it reminds me of the part in your book, I think towards the end, where you talk about Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie talking about the single story, I think, and speaking about how poor people are marginalized people or oppressed people that don't have a single story of somberness or something. I forget the exact language that you quote from her TED Talk, but that there are these sort of stories of survival and creativity and play and joy, and that's such a kind of powerfully resonant thing. And one of the delights of reading this book is that, of course, it's about resistance to the violence or horrors of patriarchy, as Nell said, but also full of sort of joy and inventiveness, and that core attribute of curiosity that you mentioned. But I wanted to ask about Campbell's schema as a foil, but I wanted to ask then if you could elaborate a bit on the heroine's journey, if there is a heroine's journey or the heroine's journey or not. Could you speak a little bit about the nature of the heroine's quest or mission, and how you explore it?
Yes, absolutely. And I think there, I started with two foundational stories, Eve and Pandora. And, it doesn't take a lot to figure out that women are often positioned as curiosities, but as curious meddlers. They're always they're nosy, they're gossipy, they want to figure things out. So even Pandora, I mean, think of that story where Eve is tempted by the serpent, and then she becomes the villain of Genesis, really, because she gives that fruit to Adam. She's the temptress. And remember, it's the fruit of the tree of knowledge. So her desire for knowledge is turned into a desire for carnal knowledge. She is read as being sexually seductive, and she brings sin and evil into the world. And then, of course, there's Pandora, who opens the jar. And what does she release but all of diseases, plagues, wars, labor, rack and ruin, leaving nothing but hope behind. So I wanted to, like all academics, when I get fixated on a word like curiosity, I run to the OED and start looking at not only the etymology, but the various uses of the word over time. And what you quickly discover is that curiosity comes from cura, care. And, this curiosity was used for, we don't know for how long, because we just have print, we have print to guide us. Print documents to guide us, but curiosity is linked to caring. Somebody who is curious is attentive, and suddenly, I mean, that was my eureka moment, really, when I realized how closely those two features were wedded, and they were really wedded to each other, and that the reflex to want to know more. I mean, I can go back to what I said about the pandemic, the healthcare workers who care and the scientists who are curious, and their curiosity shades into caring, and vice versa. So that was really the aha moment. And then that was followed by, again, not the heroine's ordeal, but the heroine's use of words and of stories. Not just to save herself, but to change her culture. And of course, the best example of this would be Scheherazade, who manages to tell stories, stop halfway through, arouse the curiosity of the king, and keep herself alive for another night when she finishes the story. And what's fascinating about Scheherazade, and what is so beautiful about her story, is that she succeeds in changing Shahryar. That is, he gives up his way. He discovers the value of his wife and of family. They have children by the time you come to the end of the stories. And so something dramatic has happened through the art of storytelling. So it becomes, I mean, there's all cliche about the pen being mightier than the sword. And this is a version of that in a way.
There's so many things I'm dying to ask you about, and this is a quick one, but you speak briefly in the book. You talk about the difference between empathy and curiosity, I think, and empathy is this virtue that we talk about a lot today. I wonder if you could say a bit more about that and what distinguishes curiosity about people, this caring interest, from empathy, which maybe has become a kind of corporate management cliche, frankly, in some respects.
When you start to hear empathy in ads for Lexus, then you really begin to worry. And I do see how it's sort of drilled into children today. And I always worry because, when children are sent these kinds of messages, they always run in the opposite direction. And I mean, obviously it's good that we, now teach that we think about all of these things, but I mean, you're right to question that connection between curiosity and empathy. Curiosity has that ethical moment in it when it is connected with caring for, if I think about it, I always identify, my favorite book as a child was Alice in Wonderland, because she's a curious curiosity. She's always, and you can't, when you're curious and investigative and exploring, you can't help but care about something and want to preserve it, admire its beauty, and keep it as it is, maybe. But then there's also, and I take this up in the book as well, the turn from curiosity to detective work, which is often seen when it's engaged in by a woman as, really suspicious. Why is Bluebeard's wife investigating her husband's past? Well, for a very good reason, because he's got a room full of dead wives. But yet her curiosity is condemned. So yes, I wish we had more time to explore that, because empathy is a term that we only started using very recently. As you know, we've talked about this, and it's about the 1890s. And then if you do a Google Ngram, you discover that it's not used that much, and suddenly it spikes, and it must be off the charts by now. But I think it's worth thinking hard about how maybe we should also nurture the curiosity of our children, something we do, but if you think of the 19th century, they demonized curiosity. All children's books are full of nasty tales about curious children who set themselves on fire and, end up in the graveyard because they are, too nosy.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I could ask you about that for hours, but I wanted to ask you too, and I wanted to say to the audience, I think Maria and I will talk a while longer, but if you do have questions, please just put them into the Q&A and I'll start gathering them, because this is your chance to ask Maria questions too. I wanted to ask a bit, you've talked about COVID and how this context of COVID and the quietness of our streets and neighborhoods was sort of one backdrop to the book, and that's rethinking of heroism. I wanted to ask you also about Me Too, which comes up, the Me Too movement, which comes up at various points throughout the book. And it struck me reading, and you'll tell me if this is right or not, but that one of those contexts, Me Too, is about certain kinds of private knowledge shared among women. So top kinds of knowledge that were thought of as private being brought into the public sphere in a different way. And that then the COVID context feels like it was this contraction of public space, and sort of we all retreated into the private space of the domestic and of storytelling. So I was curious, I mean, you speak a lot at different points in the book about Me Too, but I was curious too about that as another context for these shifts in sort of the gendered public private space that were sort of in the backdrop and in the weave in the tapestry of your writing.
Fascinating, because of course the Me Too movement became very public through social media. But I think in some ways the Me Too movement was a logical outcome of what women have always been doing, that is using extrajudicial strategies to secure justice. Maybe not necessarily just extra, but somehow working through unofficial channels. And those, you can find them you can go back to, unfortunately, we can't witness this, but we have paintings and we have some depictions of storytelling circles. Sewing circles, spinning rooms, kitchens, the places where women told story, where they gossiped, where they engaged in chit chat, and where the real life events might modulate into things that were made up. Because, if you think about fairy tales, which were told in those same spaces, sort of somewhere between the private and the public in a way, because often many people had access to those, children especially, but men as well. And there were storytelling circles for men, women, children. Sometimes you see them congregated around a fire. So this was a way of passing on wisdom across generations. I always think of Toni Morrison, how she said, listen to the ancestor, listen to the voice of the ancestor, because there's something there. It may not be exactly what you want to hear, but you can take it and make it your own, make it into a new story. So what is fascinating to me is that you find that many fairy tales took the form of denunciation narratives, with a woman married to a monstrous bridegroom, not necessarily Beast. Beast is the conciliatory version, but to someone who really is a monster, a villain who has been killing people. And how does the woman escape that marriage? She escapes, in one case, in Mr. Fox, she tells the assembled wedding guests, oh, I had this dream last night, and she proceeds to tell the story of her husband's crimes. And then at the last moment, she produces a piece of evidence, a ring that he has taken from the finger of one of his victims. So I love that, the importance of having just one piece of you tell your story. And at that point, the assembled wedding guests attack Mr. Fox, and he dies a terrible death. But so we have those stories, but we also have, this is one of the most powerful stories that I came across in researching this book, was the tale of the Patience Stone, and talk about private spaces. A woman cannot tell her story because she's been sworn to secrecy, and she knows there are going to be serious consequences if she tells her story. So what does she do? She finds a stone, an inanimate object. And it turns out that it's a magical stone, and she tells the stone her story. And as she's telling the story, the stone begins to swell, and it is so filled with empathy and sorrow that it bursts into pieces. So these extraordinary scenes of telling your story, sometimes in the most private of spaces, where it seems no one can hear, but in the stories, there's often an eavesdropper. But then in all of the in-between spaces and thresholds. And now, this extraordinary moment where the private act of telling your story has gone public.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The stone, I almost react physically to the stone story being retold. That is so powerful. I did want to ask, it was really striking both in the Mr. Fox story, where you have this sort of multiply framed narrative of words, and then the physical evidence is produced. And in the story you just described, and in Me Too, I think there are these boundary crossings, between different levels of reality or discourse, these sort of different epistemological positions. And I was thinking when you were speaking about the stone, I guess, about this Media Men document that was a major trigger of Me Too, that was, a private Google Doc that got circulated and deleted after a few minutes, and yet by the time it was deleted, it had circulated. And I was thinking, I guess I was wondering, this is me trying to cram a lot of questions into one question, but you write too about all these different media, right? There's the orality of storytelling, there are movies. You say you didn't stream, that you streamed some things. You talked about the Queen's Gambit. But you know, these different, and about social media narratives like you're talking about. And I was curious just how you think also about the difference between like weaving versus speaking. You talk about Philomela and, you know, the figures who can't speak, so they have to find some other way to tell their story. I was wondering how you think about medium, and the power invested in different media, and whether certain things, you know, maybe when you put what every woman in publishing knew from gossiping in a bar into a Google Doc, then it becomes something else, you know, or maybe when you tell the stone and it bursts, it becomes something else. I was curious if you have thoughts about medium in all this.
Oh, well, no, I didn't, but I think you sort of captured perfectly something that really needs to be addressed, to think about how stories migrate so easily from one medium to another. And then also the notion of framing and containing. And then the beauty of something like the fairy tale, which is told by women to each other, which begins with once upon a time and ends with happily ever after, though not always. So it's a way of saying, you know, this isn't the here and now. You don't have to get really anxious and worried. This is going to be something that is not part of ordinary reality, but it is a kind of what if story, and you're going to get some advice by the end of it. So, you know, one could think of a sort of trajectory that takes us from oral storytelling and the tales that are told by women that gradually migrate into books that are put between the covers of a book, and that are often edited by men, by the Brothers Grimm, or they're rewritten by Hans Christian Andersen. Most of those great 19th century collections are not produced by women. Andrew Lang's collection actually was, but by his wife and her friends, but he took full credit for it. And so then the literary tales migrate into new media, into film, TV series, into podcasts, into social media, and all of that. So I guess part of what I should say is that I was always fascinated by what Ursula Le Guin said about genre. And I mean, this is another way of thinking, you know, genre and medium, but, you know, she called herself a genre buster. And Neil Gaiman also tells us about how he'll have an idea, and it will start out as a poem and then become a graphic novel, and then become a short story, or maybe short story and then graphic novel and then a film. So he's very comfortable with that idea. And so I kind of like the idea. I don't think we can ever really map it all out in any logical way, but thinking about how the story changes as it moves to a new audience, a new medium, a new time and place, and how it has to be reinvented as well, because there's nothing worse than telling the same old story. You can't, you have to change. You have to be the iconoclast, because in an odd way, iconoclasts, even as they shatter things, break things up, they also reinvent and produce new things.
Like the stone, like the bursting stone is a kind of iconoclastic image.
Oh, exactly.
I see we have a few questions, but I was going to just selfishly ask one last question, and then I'll take some audience questions, because you brought up this matter of retelling, and you talked about how Toni Morrison talks about it in the book at various points that comes up. And one thing I found so powerful in the book is this moment in the introduction where you reflect on how sort of contemporary events, how the Me Too moment and COVID sort of led you to reconsider certain experiences in your own intellectual development, and I must say, I'm a generation maybe younger than you, and now my students feel a generation younger than me, and I relate more to you, I think. But this moment that I think many female scholars or researchers have of sort of realizing like, oh, I was only studying these male figures, or I only took them seriously. I found very powerful this moment in the book where you talk about sort of reevaluating experiences as a student and what you had cared about and read, and experiences with, you know, with the structure of the academy. So anyway, I was wondering if you could speak to this mode of revisiting, because that's been a very striking thing about Me Too too,
Yes.
how it's you know, in a way, it's things everyone knew already. We've just decided we feel differently about them now, and it's this opportunity to remake something, actually. But anyway, I wondered if you could speak a little bit, put those two things together, this moment in the book where you revisit your own education and
Yes,
these topics with what you were just saying.
May I get slightly personal?
Of course.
I'm not always comfortable in that mode, but when I was a graduate student at Princeton, I remember there was a woman who was a faculty wife who had raised her children and was working toward a degree, writing her dissertation. And what was it on but women writers? Okay, this is the 70s, early 70s. And I remember that we had no interest in what she was doing. It seemed like she was some strange bird working away in the archives. And we were knee deep in Nietzsche, Tolstoy, Kafka, Thomas Mann, and all of that. And then a few years later, what should appear? I mean, this is Elaine Showalter, who has written, the foundational work of feminist criticism, a literature of their own. And I think in my introduction, I talk about how, I just couldn't believe that I had paid no attention. There I was, I had this tremendous opportunity, and yet I dismissed her as a faculty wife. It's astonishing to me. And I'm ashamed of it. And I think that my lack of curiosity about what she was doing is something that I deeply regret. And a story that I paired with that has to do with my dissertation defense. And I'll make this brief because it's still hard for me. This is the meta moment in the book where I tell my story. I go into my dissertation defense. I think, this is going to be slam dunk, I think. I have a job at Harvard. Nothing can stop me now. I'm feeling confident, happy that I've finally written the dissertation. And I'm outside the faculty, and must have been about 15 of them at the time, are conferring. And I keep looking at my watch. My fellow students are there because they're going to participate in the defense. And after about an hour, I am in a panic. And I will give you just the ending of it. The dissertation defense went reasonably well, although I remember that I kept saying to myself, I am not going to burst into tears. I am not going to burst in. I kept saying that to myself in the back of my mind. And afterwards, my dissertation advisor said, well, this has been provisionally accepted with some revisions. And he said, is there any history between you and Professor X? And my response was, it would be unprofessional, unethical for me to, wouldn't it be unprofessional? I didn't feel that I could speak about it at all. And this was somebody who had pursued me, who, my memory is still of running for the door and being relieved that it was unlocked, and hearing this voice in the distance, saying things that I really didn't want to hear. So there I was, I couldn't tell my story. I was embarrassed. I didn't see it as traumatic. I saw it as deeply embarrassing for me somehow. And I didn't want to explain. And probably, I don't know what would have happened if I had. So I guess that's just to say that part of my mission, and I think, I'm writing about women who are on a mission, is to send a message about the value of curiosity about what is in your immediate neighborhood and surround, pay attention, and also tell your story, share it. If there's something wrong, there's nothing there's no reason to keep it to yourself. That is communicating, finding ways to communicate and passing on your experience and how you survived it is an important thing. Because this is a story that I didn't tell until maybe the past year or so. Me Too movement sort of liberated me in a way to tell it.
Well, no, I hope that wasn't putting you on the spot. I just think it's a really powerful moment in the book, that sort of meta moment. We have a number of questions that have come in for the Q&A, which, let's see, I saw one person, Velvela Weiss, asks, what is your research process usually like when finding and reading different versions of these stories? Can you speak a bit to how you found the stories in the book?
Yes, well, I think I just have a sense of excitement. I mean, that's where curiosity is awakened. When you find one story and then discover there's a completely different version of it. And of course, my first trip is to the International Tale Type Index, where you can look up a story and find that there are versions all over the world. And this was one of the, Weidman closing. I mean, we still had plenty of online resources, but there, I think my instinct was just to read as many different versions of the story as I could get my hands on. And then I'm not interested in constructing an Urmärchen, or sort of an archetypal story by any stretch of the imagination, but the differences are so fascinating and so telling, and understanding what you've emphasized, Moira, the cultural context in which it's told, the medium, the way it's framed, and the way it's told. So I guess I would say hunting and gathering, maybe, or is my strategy, something along those lines.
That's wonderful. We have two questions about specific figures, which I thought maybe I'd put together in the interest of time. Diane Reynolds asks, is Procne empathetic? Is she a heroine? I wonder how these violent women who defend and avenge other women fit the schema. And then there's a question from Dale Evans. Actually, maybe I should hold these separate. A question about Harriet Tubman as a hero. So is Harriet Tubman a heroine or a shiro? But actually, so maybe those are actually two separate questions. But yeah, could you comment on maybe the first one first, Procne?
Yes, well, Procne, of course, we don't hear a great deal about her, but just to give you a quick snapshot of the story, let's see, Philomela, raped by Tereus, and then she creates a tapestry, to recap, in which she reveals the deeds. And so Procne gets the tapestry, but I'm trying to think of how Ovid tells it. I don't think we hear a great deal about what's going on inside her mind, but then we know that she does, and the reason the story is somehow called Dangerous Sisters is, what does Procne do in her revenge? She kills Eetus and serves him up to Tereus. So, it's savagery, unimaginable savagery that makes, well, I know, they're both, Tereus and Procne both become villains in a way, but it's a complicated story. And this is what I love about these old tales, is there's no easy, simple message. That is, they lend themselves to conversation. What about Procne? That is a great question. And, what about her relationship to Philomela, and what drives her to do something that terrible?
Yeah, I realize I sequenced the questions in the wrong order. I should have paired that question about Procne with a question from an anonymous attendee who asks about how popular media have taken the Me Too movement, and says, instead of using the women of myth as models, have turned male warrior heroes into women warrior heroines. What do you think might help Hollywood change its perspective? As I interpret the question, I think it's about sort of, well, you could interpret it as well as I could, I'm sure, but about women reacting violently to violence, or sort of recapitulating these male hero virtues.
Yeah. Actually, well, that's great because it's a follow-up to the earlier question. And if you look at some of these films like Ex Machina or Get Out, and these are heroines constructed by, I think, in both cases, male scriptwriters, male directors, and all of that, where the heroine suddenly becomes the anti-heroine, bent on revenge, control, and so, is this really what we want? Again, it's such a complicated story. We are navigating our way to multiple possibilities. It's no longer going to be just, the hero and the heroine, but there's going to be a whole array of possibilities. I think Hollywood's response has been, Hollywood loves role reversal. So the first thing that happens with fairy tales is that the villains become, the protagonists, or the ones that you identify, the characters that you identify with and that you understand and sympathize with. You understand their villainy. So Hollywood is taking it in many different directions. And on the other hand, you have the example of Katniss Everdeen, the Hunger Games, where you have a woman who is a boundary crosser, a kind of trickster figure who is able to use her skills, her hunting skills, but also is able to, feels care and for her fellow warriors and that and is deeply invested in saving the lives of her people and making her culture better. So, so there's no one size fits all answer. And I think that, what is really important is to look at who wrote the script, who wrote the novel. Gosh, we could talk The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. Another great one to think about as a trickster heroine, and a new model in a way, androgynous.
Yeah, I was going to ask, but we don't have too much more time, but I was thinking of The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo as one of these sort of trickster rape revenge figures, who also plays on that paradigm. There are two more questions that seem like factual follow-up questions. One was about, Dale Evans asked, what was the name of the book and author all Hollywood scriptwriters were told to read? And I suspect there are a number that you name in the book, actually, but I don't know if there was one of these sort of Joseph Campbell influenced scriptwriting guides that you mentioned in your talk.
There are many like that, but the one that I referred to was Christopher Vogler's The Writer's Journey, which is a wonderfully accessible guide to Campbell and to writing screenplay. Reading Campbell is not easy. That is, the first 50 pages or so are, you get the 12 steps and that kind of thing. But then Campbell is truly erudite, and he marshals all of his knowledge to fill in the picture of the hero on a global scale. So Folklore is sort of easy access in a way. But yes, I wish I could rattle off the names, but I think there's one, the famous one about Don't Forget the Cat or something like that.
Save the Cat. Yeah.
Save the Cat. Thank you. Yes. Which also includes a little bit of Campbell. And yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and story, you name them in the book, I think, by that question or by the book, and they're in there. Someone else asks, another factual follow-up was what about the name of the tale type, the story about telling the secret to the stone, what the full name is. And this person points out, A. Stevenson points out, the motif is similar to telling the secret to a tree in The King with Horse's Ears, and I would love to compare them. Do you have the full name of the story about the stone?
Oh, well, it is known as I'm thinking of, there's an Armenian story called The Patient Stone. I'm just thinking that it may not be in the tale type index as the Patient Stone, but probably is something like, telling your story to an inanimate object. And maybe not even that, because there's something about that story which is so female centric. And, you know, I somehow have a feeling that that Uther, for, you know, and I credit him with, I mean, he's got 2,500 tale types to deal with, but I don't think Uther really thought about that particular situation. I'll have to check and also ask him.
One last question, which is a big one, but it seems like a good one to end on. Or do you have any favorite books or books you keep going back to, perhaps in this vein of the female storyteller?
Oh, well, we have to end with Middlemarch, maybe with the last sentence of the famous last sentence of Middlemarch. There was just an article about that, about famous first sentences in novels, and how the first sentence of Middlemarch is, and I have it here because I keep it right by my computer, by my desktop. For the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts. And the things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs. So, I mean, you know, this is unvisited tombs and unhistoric acts, hidden lives. And I suppose maybe this brings us back to Harriet Tubman, and forgive me for not being able to talk about her, because I think the next thing I'm going to do tomorrow, I'm going to start exploring her life and wondering how she fits into this pattern. So thank you for that suggestion.
I think, unfortunately, I think we've come to the end of our time, but we're better to end than with, I'm glad I don't have to say anything after that George Eliot sentence. Thank you so much for doing this event and for letting me get to ask you questions. And I think I see Nell back in front of her bookshelf. Yes, so thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Maria.
Thank you everyone. Maura, thank you.
Thanks so much to both of you. Also, Maria, thank you for making me the happiest person alive just now. Middlemarch is like my absolute favorite book of all time. I love that book more than my own soul, and you just made me so happy. So in any case, thank you also. Just what a fascinating conversation. Thank you to all of us joining at home. I reposted the link in the chat to learn more about and purchase copies of the Heroine with the 1001 Faces. Please, everyone, go check it out. Go buy it. Thank you for supporting independent bookstores in this super weird time. And everyone, be well, keep reading, stay safe. Thanks again to both of you. This was a lovely way to spend an evening. Thank you.
Thanks. Good night, everybody.